My name's Harper Harris, and I'm the lead interpreter of the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Kennesaw, Georgia. Right behind me is the world's most famous locomotive, the General. It was built in 1855 in Paterson, New Jersey at Rogers Locomotive Works. It was bought by the state of Georgia in 1856. The state bought 4 engines that year. One was named the President, one was named the Senator, one was named the Chieftain, and one was named the General. This engine cost $8,850 new, which in 1855 was quite a bit of money. It weighs 53 tons. It's 51 feet from the very back to the front. It's 13 feet from the very bottom of the wheel to the top of the stack. It could pull around 20 passenger and box cars. The average speed of a locomotive in 1860 was somewhere between 7 and 45 miles per hour. Locomotives could go faster. During the Great Locomotive Chase, they estimated that both the Texas and the General actually ran somewhere around 60 miles per hour, which in 1860 was very, very fast. It is a 440 type engine, which was originally built in the 1840s and to the 1900s. There were literally thousands and thousands of 440 engines built. They were the most popular engine, and they are called the American style engine. When we talk about a 440, we talk about the 4 wheels on the front of the engine, the 4 drivers, the big wheels are the drivers, and no wheels behind that. Some engines have different wheel configurations, and that's how they could figure out one engine from the other. On April the 12th, 1862, a band of Union soldiers and a spy by the name of James J. Andrews stole this locomotive right in front of 3,000 Confederate soldiers. This story has been called the greatest espionage story to come out of the American Civil War. In Buster Keaton's movie, he played the part of Johnny Gray, the engineer, when in reality, the gentleman's name was William Fuller, and he was the conductor of the General. James J. Andrews, a paid Union spy, and 24 Union soldiers disguised as civilians made their way 200 miles behind the Confederate lines. Their objective was to steal a northbound locomotive on the Georgia-owned Western Atlantic Railroad. This railroad was the lifeline of the Confederacy. The raiders had bought tickets for different destinations where they wouldn't look suspicious. Got on the train and the morning breakfast stop in Big Shanty, Georgia. The conductor, William Fuller, stands up, pulls out his pocket watch and hollers 20 minutes for breakfast. Everybody piled out of the engine into the Lacey Hotel to eat breakfast. While everybody was very cozy eating biscuits and gravy, Andrews had his men pull the pin between the passenger cars and the box cars, ordered his men on the box cars, gave the signal, and off they were with the locomotive, the General. Fuller, Jeff Kane, the engineer, and Anthony Murphy, a supervisor that just happened to be riding that day, took off on foot to the laughter of everybody around them. They ran down the track. They found a pole car, and they poled all the way to Cartersville, Georgia, which is 14 miles. They get to Cartersville, and they find a little locomotive engine at the Cooper Iron Works called the Yonah. There they commandeer that engine, take off down the track. At Kingston, Georgia, the Yankees are held up for an hour and 5 minutes. Finally, Andrews goes in and gets the key off the wall, switches the switch himself, and gets back on the line and takes off down the road. William Fuller pulls up, and the people at Kingston tell him, "You've missed the Yankees by 4 minutes." He cannot get his train through the town because of all the southbounds that have gotten in the way. He goes past the town and finds a track the Rome Railroad runs in with an engine sitting there called the William R. Smith. He commandeers that engine and takes off, and he rides on the front of the engine, on the pilot of the engine, because he knows that the Yankees have pulled up one track and they may have pulled up another one. They get down the road about a mile, and sure enough, they pulled up another track. Now they're on foot again. They run down the road and they meet a southbound train called the Texas. Pete Bracken's the engineer, and he asks them what's going on. They tell him the Yankees have stole their train. Pete Bracken puts his engine in reverse, drops off his box cars at Adairsville, Georgia, and now the chase is on. When they got to Tunnel Hill, the Yankees said, "Let's fight them here. This is a good place to fight them." Andrews said, "Boys, let's go on through to Chattanooga." They went on through the tunnel. made it to Ringo, Georgia, when they ran out of steam and water. Andrews said, boys, every man for himself. They hit the woods just as fast as they could. Andrews was dressed to the hilt. He had a top hat, a frock coat, saddlebags, which back then was a man of authority would carry those kind of things. When he jumped off the train, he took his hat and his coat and he threw it in the firebox. He grabbed a little cap and put a coat on and run with the rest of the guys where he wouldn't look any more suspicious. It took around 10 days for the Confederates to round up all these boys. They zeroed in on Andrews as being the leader right off. They tried him in Chattanooga, found him guilty as a spy, and sentenced him to hang. 7 of the boys they loaded on a train and sent them to Knoxville, Tennessee, where they tried them and found them guilty as the spies. They sent them back to Atlanta, and James J. Andrews was taken out and hanged. 11 days later, they took the 7 boys that were tried in Knoxville and hanged them. The rest of the boys that were still in jail decided that they would make a jailbreak. They knocked the guard in the head, and 8 of them made it out. Of that 8, 6 snuck up through the North Georgia mountains and made it back to Chattanooga across the Tennessee River and turned themselves back into the Union Army. 2 of the boys made it to the Chattahoochee River, and they floated all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It took them 21 days to float right down to Apalachicola where the Yankee ships were. They paddled right up to the Yankee ships and turned themselves in. 6 of the boys were exchanged in a prisoner exchange where they went to Washington, where they were hailed as heroes, and they went before Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln thought it was such a brave thing what these boys had done, stealing the locomotive, the General, and trying to burn the bridges, that he had Secretary of War Edwin Stanton give these boys the first Medal of Honor. We are now in the cab of the locomotive, the General. This is the original locomotive that James J. Andrews and his raiders stole on April the 12th, 1862. Tell you a little bit about the firebox. This is where they put wood and of course later on the coal into the firebox. The firebox has a rack inside of it, and that rack, the fire is built on top of that rack. It has a damper that allows air to come in through the bottom of that rack, and that's what keeps your fire going. When they get too many coals in there or they want to empty that, they have a little kick mechanism right here on the floor that when they kick it, it drops. It opens this rack and literally lets the coals and stuff drop onto the rails and the tracks. The boiler itself holds water, and there's 130 tubes, 2-inch tubes that are 11 feet long that run from the back of the boiler to the front of the boiler underneath the smokestack. Your water is in between those flues, and the heat and the fire and the smoke and the gases are drawn through those pipes, and that's what keeps the water boiling. This is the Johnson bar. The Johnson bar is very important to the locomotive. This is what controls the valve on top of the pistons. This allows the steam to be shot into the front or the rear of the piston. When you start off, you want all the steam you can get. As the engine gets to moving and you get your momentum built up, you drop the Johnson bar back. It closes the valve further down where it's opened up less and less steam is used. In emergency, if you have to throw it in reverse, you throw this thing completely back, and it completely reverses the mechanism and makes the engine go in reverse. The Great Locomotive Chase, the Texas was in reverse. They could not turn the engine around. They chased the General for 57 miles in reverse. Now, a locomotive is not like a car. It will run just as fast in reverse as it will forward. These locomotives would, they averaged about 33 miles on a tank of water. A tank of water was usually 1,600 gallons. They had to stop every 33 miles and fill this thing up. That's why you had all the little towns up and down the line. It's because you had to have the water source to make these things run, and they run on water. This engine would held 2 cords of wood. 1 cord of wood would burn 1 tank of water. I tell people, it gets 33 miles on 1,600 gallons. That's not very good water mileage, is it? Of course, you would have had a pressure gauge, and if you'll notice, this pressure gauge says WNARR, which stands for the Western Atlantic Railroad. This piece you see right here is the sander. You pull this, and this drops sand. If you ever really noticed a locomotive track, it'll be just as slick as if somebody shined it with a piece of sandpaper. And the reason that is you've got the metal wheels going across on top of the metal rails, and it just shines this thing and makes it just slick as glass. And every engine had a sandbox in the middle of the engine, and they pull this pipe or pull this lever, and the pipe drops sand on the front of the driver to give it traction. And even modern engines today have a button that they mash, and it drops sand on the track when they need some traction. Now, they replaced a lot of things on this engine. Things would wear out. They would have to replace it just like you would do any kind of maintenance on any kind of piece of machinery. This engine been rebuilt several times. Of course, during the Civil War, the engine was, the General and 3 other locomotives were in Atlanta with 82 boxcars of ammunition. The Yankee Army cut all the rail lines around the city. They could not get the engine out. General Hood, the Confederate commander of Atlanta at the time, said, okay, destroy them. So they took the boxcars and they put them in 2 rows, put the engines right in the middle, torched the ammunition boxes, and it blew these 4 engines all to pieces. After the Civil War, the engines were given back to all the states that the Union had captured them, to the Confederate states. And this engine was given back to the state of Georgia. And the state of Georgia looked at it and said, well, you know, it's only 11 years old. Let's rebuild her. So they sent her to Nashville and completely rebuilt her, put a new boiler on her, converted her to run on coal. Now, by the time the Civil War was over, they had started mining a lot more coal. And during the war, coal was pretty expensive, and they usually used them on ships to let the ships have the coal. And there were a few coal burners during the Civil War, but most of them were wood burners. Of course, when the war was over and they started mining a lot of coal, coal became readily available. The price went down. So they said, let's change these engines to coal burners. Now, the engineers and the firemen and all the guys and the conductors, they did not like coal when it first came out. Coal smells. It's very nasty. Smoked up everything. It caught the woods on fire a lot better than wood did, which was a problem for the railroads. It would burn the farmer's wood, and he'd get mad about that. The engines back then all were painted very elaborate, very fancy, kind of like a circus wagon back then. But when they started using coal, it became so much trouble to keep these engines clean and to keep them still painted up that they said, let's paint them black. So most of your engines from around 1890s all the way into the 50s or 1940s, early 50s are all black, because it was just so much easier just to paint everything flat black than try to paint something fancy. So they got away from that, after the Civil War. We just found out recently that we found some records. Rogers, some of the old Rogers Locomotive Works, where this engine was built in Paterson, New Jersey, found some records, and we actually found out what color the General was, and it was a green and orange looking color. The metal on the boiler was what we call Russian steel. They were beautiful engines, and they loved to paint them up. Sometimes they would paint fancy scenes on the headlights or on the side of the engine. Sometimes they'd paint up somebody's face, a portrait. These guys, a lot of times these engineers were so proud of their engine, they'd have their picture on the side of them. It was a big deal to be an engineer 150 years ago. That was like being an airline pilot. And a very big deal to be a conductor. The conductor was the boss, not the engineer. The conductor was the one responsible for taking up the tickets. He was the one responsible for making sure the safety of the locomotive, that nobody got hurt. He was everybody else's boss. So if something went wrong with the engine and they were late, guess who got in trouble? The conductor, not the engineer. So in the same way with the Great Locomotive Chase, when William Fuller was eating biscuits and gravy and the Yankees stole his train, what a horrible thing for him to happen to this guy. Here he is eating biscuits and gravy, and they steal his train right in front of him. In 1893, the NC in St. L completely rebuilt the engine. In 1897, she was put in the Union Station in Chattanooga, where she sat for years. In 1926, Buster Keaton approached the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad with a request asking them to use the original locomotive, the General. And when Buster Keaton arrived in Chattanooga with his staff to make the movie, he had an interview, and he told the interviewer the movie would be a comedy. This didn't set well with the local veterans, and they started writing letters to the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad, and they decided not to let Buster Keaton use the original General. Buster Keaton then went west to Oregon. Buster Keaton used 3 logging locomotives. They were 440 engines, very similar to the engines that were used in the real Great Locomotive Chase. He had them modified. He took the new parts off of them. He put old headlights on them. He put old whistles on them. And he covered up the air brakes in between the drivers to make them look more authentic. One he used for the Texas and one he used for the General. One was used to make the most expensive scene ever made in a silent movie, was the bridge scene where the Texas falls into the river. That scene was said to have cost $42,000 to make. Now, that engine sat for 15 years in the river, and in World War II, it was brought up and sold for scrap. The other 2 locomotives after the movie were put back in service in the logging camps and ran till the 40s, where they were scrapped too later on in the late 40s. This engine has been modified several times. It's had 3 different fuel sources. It originally was built as a wood burner, was later on converted to coal, ran as a coal burner for several years, and then converted in 1961 to a diesel oil burner. In 1961, L&N Railroad took the engine out of the station in Chattanooga, where she had sat since 1898, took her to Louisville, Kentucky, and completely rebuilt her for the Civil War centennial. When she was ready, she was rolled out, steamed up. She drove approximately 18,000 miles on her own steam. She was taken to New York to the World's Fair, taken to Chicago, all through the Midwest, Kentucky, Ohio, all through the southern states. She was the highlight of the Civil War centennial. In 1969, she was given to the state of Georgia, and it's been in this building since 1972.